To all of those who've joined us so far, I want to say thank you. And to all of those who may be viewing this as a recording in the future, thank you for joining us as well. First off, my name is Will Moore. I am the Executive Marketing Manager for the Life Sciences list here at Macmillan Learning. And we're so happy to have you all today. I'm really excited to introduce our presenter today, Jim Morris of Brandeis University. He's a professor of biology and the author of Biology: How Life Works in the higher ed space, and also of a AP biology book for us as well. And he is here today to talk about improving biology education through a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Jim's presentation will be roughly a half hour. We would love to have questions and interaction as well, so we'll have time for Q&A at the end, but if you feel free to use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen, you can send questions in. I'll moderate those throughout, and if it makes sense to kind of pause and address those along the way, we'll go ahead and do so. So I will hand it off to you, Jim, to go ahead and get us started. And again, thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Will, and good to see everybody. Thanks also for taking the time to participate in this webinar. So the topic today is improving biology education through a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So essentially, what we're going to talk about is how to include everybody in the classroom, or the notion that, biology is really for everyone. And I guess as a teacher, that seems obvious, but we don't have to think too far back to remember a time when our biology classrooms, first of all, weren't very diverse. And even the goal of many of the intro classes was to weed out students rather than to include students. And also, it might seem very simple. Of course, as teachers, we want to include everybody. But what I thought we'd focus on in this webinar is, what are some of the practices that we can use to create a truly inclusive classroom? It isn't so simple. And I think some of the practices we can sort of share and talk about might make for a more inclusive classroom. Now, I assume I didn't see the full participant list, but I know many of you are teachers. And so as teachers, obviously, we care about, including everybody in the classroom. But it's not just that we care about it, but it's also that the notion of including everybody, if students feel included, if they have a sense of belonging, that's one of the sort of best predictors of success in science. So we care about it not just from the notion of being a teacher, but also in sort of fostering that sense of belonging and community. And I think we're all scientists. And as a scientist, I also think we kind of have a responsibility to make science, accessible, understandable, and even engaging, because we want to we're not just training scientists, we're also training, scientifically literate citizens who care about or are knowledgeable about things like public health or COVID or climate change or the environment or cancer or health. So that's kind of the perspective that we're going to go on here. There we go. I'm going to approach this webinar as a teacher, because that's what I am. I'm a teacher. I'm a practitioner. Every day I walk into the classroom, and one of my goals is to include students. I want to say right off the bat, I'm not approaching this as an expert. And what I mean by that is I don't do research in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is not kind of my research area, but it's a topic that I really care a lot about. So I do a lot of reading in this area. I go to meetings. For example, actually, Will and I were both at Sabre West recently, where the focus of that meeting was on equity. And so I'm going to approach this very much as a teacher. And as I said, I teach at Brandeis. Brandeis, for those of you who don't know, is a sort of liberal arts college and research university. It's located right outside of Boston. I regularly teach. Every year I teach intro bio. I teach it every fall. And at Brandeis, intro bio is maybe something like 300 or 400 students. And I've taught it both in person and online. So I'm going to be drawing a lot of my experience from that class, and I'll be using it as an example. I also teach upper level classes. I teach genetics, anatomy. I teach a first year seminar. I teach a project lab class. And so those are some of the things I'll be drawing from. When I talk about sort of diversity or including different students, some of that is going to come from Brandeis. But I also have had a lot of experience at a nearby school, Harvard, but Harvard Extension School. Harvard Extension School is Harvard's kind of open enrollment school, and where they focus mostly on adult learners. And Brandeis is certainly diverse, but Harvard Extension School draws in kind of a different kind of group of students. These are primarily adult learners. They range in age from, say, as young as 20 to maybe as old as 80. They have a diversity of careers, experiences, interests. And so this sort of challenges me in sort of a different way than college. College has a certain kind of diversity, and Harvard Extension School in addition. I also taught for 1 year actually at the National Institute of the Deaf in Paris, where of course shared goals of learning, but working with a deaf community and the deaf population provides certainly opportunities, but also challenges. Will mentioned that I'm an author of a textbook, Biology: How Life Works. There's the 3rd edition and there's the 4th edition. I mention this because I can't really separate my teaching from my writing of this book. What I do in the classroom often finds its way into the book, and what I include in the textbook often finds its way into my classroom. So the two are very much complementary exercises, experiences. And so when I draw on different experiences today, I'm going to take some from the classroom and some from this textbook as well. One of my longstanding interests actually is the public understanding of science and research. For years, I gave talks right there. That's the Museum of Science in Boston, where the goal was to reach a general audience. And that provides even kind of more challenges in terms of reaching people. You have only seconds to either hook people or they'll walk right by. They're not required to be in attendance at all. And so I think a lot of what I've learned from this experience, I've been able to sort of bring into the classroom in terms of engaging students. And I've even tried my hand at some popular science writing, not doing so well there, but it's something I'm really interested in there. But again, I just bring this up because there the audience is extremely broad. So I'm going to sort of pick and choose from these kinds of experiences. And I just wanted to give you the perspective from which I'm approaching this topic. So the topic that we're really talking about, including everybody in the classroom, often goes by the acronym DEI, as you know, where DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we can't really talk about including everybody in the classroom without kind of a notion of DEI. Now, some people are using DEI. Some people have sort of enlarged this notion, and they're calling it AGEDI. I was at the NABT conference in Indianapolis where Sarah Miller talked about AGEDI. It was the first I heard of it, where A stands for anti-racism and J for justice. Though I've also seen from some reading I've done that A sometimes stands for accessibility. So the topics that we're going to talk about today partly go with DEI and partly go with this notion of AGEDI. And, you know, Will and I were talking recently about how this sort of efforts around DEI also sort of dovetail with the notion of accommodations. How do we include everybody in the classroom? How do we accommodate all students so that they all can succeed? So this topic will sort of touch on things like accommodations and AGEDI, but I'll use the DEI framework as a way to kind of organize efforts and practices in this area. Oh, I forgot to say, and I do want to say that I said I'm approaching this as a teacher. I say I'm not approaching this as a researcher. But there's one more thing I need to acknowledge right off the bat, and I think it's obvious, so maybe it's almost like I forgot to say it. I'm also approaching this as a white male. And you could ask the question, what in the world do I have to offer in the area of diversity, equity, inclusion? And in a way, I think, first of all, I think it's important for me to acknowledge that. And I think in some ways, I have to sort of approach this topic in a really deliberate and intentional fashion because I'm a white male, and I really want all my students not just to feel, but to be welcome. And so I think this is one other reason why I pay particular attention to this area, because perhaps it's something that I might have to work on. And so I'll share my experiences from that perspective. Okay, with that as an introduction, let's focus first on diversity. Now, you don't need me to tell you that our classrooms and our students are getting increasingly diverse. Literally our classrooms are not all the same. So here's a lecture hall at Brandeis with traditional stadium style seating. That's one way we teach. There's also active learning classrooms where students can engage in small group work and do problems and active learning. And of course, during the pandemic, many of us were teaching on Zoom. And these different forms, they're different, but they all present the challenge still of how do you include an increasingly diverse a set of students. And we've all noticed that our students are more and more diverse. They're diverse in terms of where they come from. They're diverse in terms of their levels of preparation, their ethnic and racial backgrounds, their career goals, their gender identities. They're diverse in many, many ways. And so the question is, what kind of practices can we use in our classroom or in our resources to sort of speak to this kind of diversity and allow them to be included? I have a blank slide here because I think one of the simplest things, or one of the first place I like to start, is just to start simply. And one of the simplest things that I find can have a really powerful effect is just to learn everyone's names, even in a large classroom. I think in that way, if you use students' names, if you call them by their names, they literally are sort of seen and heard. And I find that it can be very simple, but extremely powerful. I also, on this sort of level of simplicity, I always begin by sharing something about myself. And that just gets to, I mean, not highly personal stuff, but I share a few things about myself, classes I've teach, where I'm from, my own interests, because I said I'm a white male, but that doesn't wholly define me. I also play the bassoon, or I learned to make sourdough bread during the pandemic. I like to hike and run. And the reason for sharing this kind of information is we all have points of connection. Yes, we're all diverse. Yes, we have all these different identities, but they don't solely define us. And presenting myself, sharing some of my interests allows points of connections with students. So that's kind of some simple ways to begin and things I do in the classroom. Another construct I really like, but it's often not talked about in the higher ed space, is this notion of windows and mirrors. Windows and mirrors was as a framework for inclusive teaching that was developed by Emily Stile. Emily Stile is the co-founder of something called SEED, Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity. And it's mostly, as I said, a K through 12 curriculum. But this is something I kind of keep front and center. So wait, first of all, what is windows and mirrors? Windows and mirrors is the notion that as you're teaching, you're pulling out examples, right? And you're telling stories and you're showing figures. And think about the balance for students about which one of these examples are windows and which ones of them are mirrors for all of your students. A window is a view into somebody else's experience. It's something that pushes people beyond what they're comfortable with. And a mirror is a mirror. It reflects your own identity. And the trick here is not to do too much of one or the other. And a window and a mirror will be different for your different students. So I use this construct all the time. As I bring up examples of scientists or stories or figures, how many of those are windows for my students or for different kinds of students? And how many of them are mirrors? And I actually intentionally go through my classes and I try to pick and choose and change the examples so that I'm reaching a broad audience. Again, you don't want too many windows for anybody, but you also don't want too many mirrors, because science, it's not science. Teaching, learning should be about exploration, the windows, and mirrors, sort of safe spaces where you can belong. Again, I think this is a great notion for sort of fostering that sense of belonging. And so how does this play out? Okay, for the example of how this plays out, I'll bring up How Life Works. In How Life Works, we are constantly telling stories, using examples, and showing figures. So as we develop each edition, we really pay attention to the kind of figures and scientists that we're using. So ever since the first edition, for example, Jane Goodall has been in chapter 1. You know, that's not an accident that Jane Goodall is in chapter 1. I mean, first of all, she's one of my personal heroes, and I wanted to put her front and center, but she's also a woman scientist, and women were traditionally, you know, underrepresented in science. And so it's not an accident that she's in chapter 1. And as we revised to the 4th edition, we brought in more information about COVID, and we brought in the research of Carico Catalan. She did important research in mRNA that's really was instrumental in the mRNA vaccines that we're using for COVID. We also developed a set of podcasts, and in the podcast, one of the authors interviews a scientist. And as we chose the 8 scientists, we paid careful attention to their backgrounds, to their experiences, even to their levels of training, whether they're full professors or postdocs, for example. We tried to bring in diverse set of voices that reflects sort of the diverse community in which science is practiced, so that for some of our students, they will be windows, people that are unfamiliar with them, and some will be mirrors. They want to see themselves in the examples, in the figures, and in the illustrations to promote the kind of that sense of belonging. So I do that both through the textbook and in my own teaching. Okay, so that's sort of that's not the diversity. Those are a few thoughts around diversity. I want to spend a little more time on equity. Equity is kind of the notion, not really of treating everybody equally, but instead giving everybody what they need to succeed. So there's sort of a meme for this that's, I don't know if it's a meme, an image that's gone around the internet sort of to illustrate the notion of equity and how it should play out in a classroom. And it's a picture of, three people watching a baseball game. And this is the notion right here of giving everybody treating everybody equally. And if you treat everybody equally, not everybody can see the game. So, but if you treat everybody equitably, give them what they need to succeed, well, then that allows them to all see the game. And there are some issues with this illustration, which I'll get to in a moment, but let's just stop at this point and just consider this. This notion of giving students what they need often bumps up or dovetails with the notion of accommodations, right? I'm seeing more and more different types of accommodations in my classrooms and many more accommodations. And the challenge has been how to sort of meet those accommodations so that everybody can feel included and succeed in my class. And I guess those different blocks could represent different kinds of accommodations, whether it's extra time or a large font or low distraction or the kinds of other accommodations that we're seeing. So how in our teaching or in our resources, how can we sort of work on this notion of equity? The first one's kind of simple. One thing, and I'll take one from the textbook and one from my classroom. And the classroom is one I'd love some input on at the end. So one thing I do in the textbook is provide a set of primers, and primers are kind of self-paced tutorials that students can turn to anytime to get what they need. So for example, you'll see this list, this is kind of an older list, but these represent skills like graphing or quantitative reasoning or phylogenetic trees. These are topics that we cover kind of throughout the class. Some students are well prepared in these areas and others need some extra help. So these are resources that students can turn to at any point to kind of get them up to speed. I think of them as on-ramps to the classroom. They don't take the material and go further. They really start very basic and bring it up to the level that I expect everybody to be at. They're self-paced, they're always available, and they are interactive. They allow students to kind of read, practice, and then answer questions. So I think that's a really good sort of useful tool for bringing people to the sort of students to the same level. But the one I want to spend more time on is I want to go back to this image for a second. If you look at this image closely, I think one of the things you'll notice is that there's this barrier there, and we're giving students what they need to kind of get over the barrier. But one thing you might have asked, and you might be asking this yourself right now, is why is there a barrier there in the first place? Why not, instead of giving students what they need to kind of get over the barrier, why not kind of just remove the barrier? Why are there barriers in the first place such that students need to be accommodated? And this notion, I think that's represented kind of nicely in this image, goes by the name of universal design. Why don't we design our classes or our resources in a universal way where everybody gets what they need in the way it's taught, in the way it's sort of presented? That would, first of all, include everybody right off the bat, so to speak. But as I learned in working on the textbook, actually, one of the developmental editors made the point, and I really took it to heart, that something that's truly accessible, that doesn't have barriers, is also good pedagogy. In other words, it works not just for the people who need it, it actually works for everybody. So what we're getting at is in the notion of universal design. And, and I'm not going to talk about the textbook here, but in the textbook, we do design it universally, or we provide, it's talked about as accessible. So we watch colors and font sizes and closed captioning. So universal design is kind of baked into any textbook these days. But my question here, and the one that I think is worth exploring, is could you incorporate universal design into a classroom? And if you had universal design, in a way, you wouldn't have to provide accommodations. And again, not as a way to get around accommodations. It's in fact just to do the opposite, to create an environment where everybody can succeed using the kind of same set of I don't want to say rules, but practices. And so that's something I'm toying with. I haven't quite done this yet, but I'm thinking of this fall of changing my intro bio class to be truly universally designed. And what does that mean, to be truly universally designed? Oh, I was going to say I'm obviously not the first. So here's an article that just was in Nature about making math curriculum universal. So one way I was thinking of, and I haven't done this yet, so this is, again, I'd love your thoughts on this, is to make it a project-based rather than an exam-based class. So the problem I'm having with exams is that well, there's a lot of problems with exams. One is how to administer them. Number two, the kind of the range of times. But then the biggest thing I'm finding with exams is that, some people do fine and get 95%, others will get a 75%, and some a 60%. And they take the exam and then they're done, and then they go and take the next exam. And the problem is that leaves some students with maybe with 75% of the knowledge or 60% of the knowledge or something like that. And I know there's ways to change exams. So you could do specs grading where they have multiple attempts, for example, or you can have them take it once by themselves and once in groups. But maybe I can change that all to sort of a project-based way of learning. So for example, let's say in a course that focuses on evolution, the projects might look something, I'm just throwing these out for discussion. They might look something like, come up with a timeline of history of Earth and life. If I give it to them not to scale, draw it to scale. If I talk about key events in class, have them added to the timeline. Make analogies between the timeline of Earth's history and, say, a 60-second clock or a 12-month calendar or the length of your arm or a football field, with a nod to the Super Bowl last night. Have them write a research paper. Have them engage with actual rich materials. Read The Origin of Species and write a blog on it. Create their own tree of life, picking their 10 favorite organisms and map them onto the tree of life. Focus on extinction that we're currently experiencing, the sixth extinction. Pick an animal, pick an organism that's endangered or going extinct. Really engage with some of this in sort of a project-based way. What I like about this is it's not just, it allows students, it removes a time element. It gives students the opportunity to practice it in the space they want. There's opportunities for revision so that hopefully everybody will get those by the end, and if they're aligned with your learning goals, then everybody might achieve those learning goals. So there's opportunities for mastery. They're engaging in rich materials, genuine materials like research papers or timelines or The Origin of Species. Students would have ownership of what they're doing, and they're creating their own materials, which obviously exams have. Exams do some things, but it's an artificial kind of construct. And and grading would be on a sort of threshold level grading. In other words, they get a round of feedback, and if they get above a threshold, they get full credit. So we don't deal with sort of small 1 point here, 1 point there. Anyway, it's an idea I'm playing with. And to me, I think what's interesting about it, it removes the notion of sort of accommodations for students, which sort of puts the burden on the student, and instead reverses it. Maybe the burden should be on the class to sort of reimagine it where accommodations kind of aren't needed because everybody's on a level playing field. Anyway, it's a thought. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but I'm going to keep going with sort of the rest of the talk. The last one is of the DEI, of course, is inclusion. And this is certainly not the most important of the three. Diversity is important, equity is important. But I focus a lot on inclusion. Even if you listen to the way I'm talking about it, I always talk about including everybody in the classroom. And I think the reason for that is that if students don't feel included, it doesn't matter how diverse your classroom is, and doesn't matter how equitable your classroom is. If there's not that sense of inclusion, you can't get out the gate. I think it's almost like the necessary first step. So what I want to talk about here is sort of what kind of practices can we use to make a more inclusive classroom? What can we actually do in the classroom to make it more inclusive? And I thought I'd share 3 or 4 things, mostly coming from the classroom space that I do in my class to try to make it more inclusive. And one of those practices I always use is I have an active classroom. So many of you know that having an active classroom is sort of an efficacious, a good way to teach, that it's that the learning gains are much better than if you straight lecture. And there's been many papers to sort of support the notion that active classrooms is effective and is an effective way of teaching, including many from Scott Freeman. But if you notice, these early papers focused on closing the achievement gap and focusing on the efficacy of this kind of way of teaching. If you read more recent papers on active classrooms, they focus more on inclusion, that active classrooms not only help to close the achievement gap or make it narrower, but also students feel more a sense of belonging and inclusion. And so, I mean, it's hard to separate these two. Maybe it's because they feel more a sense of inclusion that they feel more engaged and then end up learning more. So I'm not sure which comes first, but an active classroom is clearly also a more inclusive classroom. So I pay very much attention to that. Now, where do I get my activities from? Some I come up from myself. So at Brandeis, I've just sort of come up with some. I came up with a game. This was actually one that I developed at a scientific institute, where you come up with an activity that you can use in your class to teach a concept like reciprocal altruism. As you can already see, I'm really focused on the timeline. So I came up with a in-class activity that students can actually do in class that's participatory to talk about those key events in the history of life. And this is one where I introduce a group of flightless birds and they build a phylogeny out of it. Again, instead of telling them about how to build a phylogeny, they actually do it in class based on a series of shared derived characters. So those are some of the activities I've come up with in How Life Works. We offer many kinds of activities. John Merrill came up with this one, a sort of box and arrow activity on inputs and outputs in glycolysis and cellular respiration and photosynthesis, and it really helps students to focus on major inputs and outputs. It's a very kind of powerful activity, and he's paired it with clickers to make it very easy to do in class. This is another one I call double, double, double. I actually love this activity. It's one I've used all the time now. It's focusing on, there's so many doubles in genetics, right? There's the double helix, there are the two sister chromatids after DNA replication, and there's the homologous chromosomes, and students notoriously confuse them. And this is just a very simple, 2-minute activity that literally helps to untangle these doubles. And I've used it in my classroom and I've done some assessment afterwards. It's very quick, but also very powerful in terms of helping students to see this, much more powerful than if I just talk to them about it. This is the third edition of How Life Works, but we have like 7,500 in-class activities that you can use or not use. But what I like about it, and the reason why I'm bringing this out, is that I find activities are really powerful but hard to create. If you have at least a start, you can model it to your own classroom, tailor it to your own classroom. But I think this is a great place to start for having an active classroom. Another way to be more inclusive is to have a structured classroom, and this really mirrors what I just said about an active classroom. The early
Jim,
studies.
can I pause for a question before we move
Oh,
on?
I would love that. Thank you. It's so hard to just talk like this. Yes.
Yeah, no problem. The question came in, said a lot of the suggestions you made for project-based learning, timelines, etc., seem to me to be easily Googled. The struggle I have is how to assess learning in this context. I can see how project and team-based learning may be good for learning, but I wonder about how to fairly assess the learning. How do we know what each individual has actually learned, what they understand, and what they can do, especially true in a large classroom?
I mean, you've hit the exact thing I'm thinking about. So how can I design good projects, right? So if I'm going to move to a project-based one, how can they be good projects? So this is something that's completely on my mind. I've been spending the spring and I plan to spend the summer because it's going to be for a fall rollout. So I think the question is not just Google anymore, but also ChatGPT. So if let's just say I ask a simple question that I want them to write something about, ChatGPT, these chatbots can really generate it now. So I have to think really deliberately about the kinds of activities that are not Googleable and not ChatGPTable. And believe me, I've been thinking about that. In fact, I think the timeline fits that perfectly in many ways, because I'm asking them to generate something, not write about a timeline. I literally want them to draw a timeline. Now, I know there are timelines out. Oh, I see. There's timelines out there. So could they copy it? Sure. Yes. But in some ways, first of all, the first part of that is good. They're researching things and finding them, which I think is great. But how do you make it unique, something that they can't just copy mindlessly? And that's where I think is the connection to class. So with any project, you can't just have them do a project and have it unaligned to class. That's something I'm going to talk about in a moment. It has to actually come from class. So for example, I might in class mention 10 key events, and I might want them to map those key events onto their timeline. These wouldn't just be generic events that you could get, they might be particular to the class. So that to me is a nice combination of, okay, first of all, taking something that they can research. Yes, they can find timelines online, which I want them to do. I want them to be comfortable finding things, but finding it, linking it to class, only bringing in material from class, and then importantly, adding it themselves. So I don't know, that's one way to do it. In terms of sort of then taking it, I also think with projects, it's really important to have them tiered. And what I mean by tiered or staged. So maybe hand that in, get some feedback, hand it back, but then take it one step further. Now I'd like you to put it on to the 60-second clock or a football field. That's hard to Google, I have to say. There are some of those things out there again, but I think they're going to have to take what they have out there and learn it. So I think the idea of generation, like that's something that they're creating, can help to get around that. In terms of grading, which I think was a part of that question, how do you assess it? I don't know. I mean, I do know, but the question really is, how are you going to do that with 400 students? And I'm hoping that this threshold grading might help. So I'll have a very clear rubric, and that if they meet certain criteria, they're going to get full credit. And I'm wondering, I'm not sure about this, is that going to be, that might be easier to grade, honestly, than right now I grade 400 exams. And we're really getting it right down to the, half a point. And I'm finding spending so much time on those half points, I spend time on the half points, but so do the students. I think a lot of this is motivated, and I don't want to get too far off the point here, is motivated by the fact that I spend so much of my time in a large class talking about the mechanics of the class, arguing about points, arguing about regrades, and talking about accommodations. And I think those are all important. Grading is important, accommodations are important, but we're actually then not talking about the substance of the class. And I'm wondering, and I don't know if it's true, whether these projects will move us away towards, well, then we'll talk about the content, the creation of the project, and not about points, because it's not graded on a point basis. And everybody's kind of playing by the same rules because of the universal design aspect. That's my hope. I don't have perfect answers for you. Like I said, it's an experiment, something I'm excited about to try. I don't know if that was helpful.
Thank you, Jim.
Sure, I don't
One
know.
other question that I answered in text in the Q&A section,
Yeah.
somebody asked they would very much like to sample the in-class activities. Is there any way we can get to them? And I put the link in the question and answer section where you can go to our catalog page and request access to our Achieve online learning system. And that's where you can have a look at the activities that accompany How Life Works.
Yeah, I actually, and just, it's a shout out for How Life Works, but I'll actually just say, let's be book agnostic for a second here. Active learning is incredibly powerful in everything we're talking about, making students feel belonged, getting them to engage in class, helping them to participate, helping them to see themselves as a scientist. So whether you're generating them yourselves, I do think How Life Works has a great library of them, or there are other good resources. I know, what is it? It's, sorry, I'm slipping on the thing. There's another one out there that I've used before. I'm just slipping on the name. Anyway, the key here is incorporating active learning into your classroom. Lectures are fine. They give you good orientation, but I tend to, when I lecture, try to keep it in 10-minute chunks, not 30 minutes like I'm doing for you right now. Okay, I'll keep going with a few more thoughts and we can continue them with questions if that works. Okay. The structured classroom, I was just going to say, mirrors active learning. I think the early studies of active learning focus on its efficacy and increasingly are focused on inclusion, and same with a structured classroom. And again, returning to people like Scott Freeman, who has looked at, how a structured classroom can really disproportionately affect students who may be struggling. And what does a structured classroom mean? Oh, but then more recently, people are looking at structured classroom also helps students feel included. And here are two papers that sort of speak to this. So what does it mean to have a structured classroom? I mean, I think structured classroom begins with a syllabus, really clear expectations, really clear timelines, really clear homework and assignments. Although this is the class that I'm trying to sort of explore in a project-based way. I think having a clear syllabus is a good place to start in terms of structure. But one of the things I'm starting to pay attention to, if we're going to have clear structure, can we convey it in a way that speaks to students better? In other words, I always put this out. This is my syllabus, the top part of it. It's really clear. It's very structured. And as you might imagine, students don't read it. Is there a way to present a syllabus that's still structured and still clear, but might start speaking students' languages, students' language? And I don't mean actual language. I just mean like, maybe the beginning is the same, but we do it as a series of frequently asked questions. Maybe that's a more conversational way of conveying the same thing. Or I have another colleague who shared his syllabus with me. He's really sort of blown up the syllabus and make a graphical syllabus. All the information is there. It's still accessible, and it still meets all the criteria of structure. But maybe this is a little more engaging. So if structure is important, maybe communication is too, communicating that structure to students. So that's another thing I've sort of been playing with, and something I'm going to develop this summer along with my project-based class. Structure is not just in the sort of way we present information or how we organize it. One of the other ways I pay attention to structure is in what I might think of as a learning path for students. I really pay a lot of attention to how I pace learning. And what I mean by that is, what do I expect students to do before class? What are we doing in class? And not just randomly, but how does that tie to what they prepared? Students will not come to class prepared if the pre-class doesn't connect in some ways to the in-class. After in-class, they've learned certain things, but they could take it further. Well, that's the post-class, what we call homework. And then whether it's an exam or a project or whatever your summative assessment is, does it align with it? Because if not, then there's a disconnect between the two. So I also think of structure in terms of the path that students take through it in a way of supporting all of my students. And I think when I talk about structure, that sort of, and I think we were getting that when we were just talking about projects, this notion of alignment. I think this is talked about a lot in the educational literature. I've seen it talked about a little less from the point of view of this notion of inclusion or inclusivity. What I mean by alignment is, actually here I'll steer towards how life works, but actually the same holds for a classroom. If you're going to ask a question or do an activity, and I'll use the question mark to represent sort of something that students are grappling with doing, it can't come out of nowhere. There has to be an alignment between what they're reading, if they're reading, and what they're doing. And what they're doing should be aligned with the kind of media or figures that you're showing. In other words, the language and the level and the imagery needs to be consistent. Which sort of moves us to the internet for a minute. You know, the internet is wonderful, right? Because everything's out there. But the pitfall of the internet is that everything is out there. And so they use lots of different levels and lots of different ways of speech and lots of different modes of representation. And of course, in the long run, we want students to be conversant. We want them to be flexible thinkers and not just see actin as green, for example. But as intro bio students, we do not want to make biology harder than it is. And I think alignment is I don't want to say an easy way, but a way to make biology easier, not harder. In other words, if our goal is to teach actin or gene expression or whatever this is showing, we want to use consistent words, questions, and media so that the point can come across. And we don't want to make it unnecessarily difficult. So I think this notion of alignment is something we need to pay attention to. If we're using a set of resources, how tightly aligned are the resources? Or if we're letting students just explore, to what extent is that going to be helpful for them or not? You know, Rob Liu, our art and media director, really paid attention to, he took this one step further. He drove home the point for me about also not just having a textual language and textual sort of consistency, but visual language and visual consistency. And so this is something that I pay a lot of attention to in my classroom. So this is translation going on, and this is the ribosome. And you'll note that figures are using sort of this visual language. In a visual synthesis, there's that same figure, you're reinforcing it. If you pull an animation, it's not a random animation, but it's an animation that's using the same iconography, the same visual language. And if this blows up to sort of something slightly different from 2D to 3D, you're still using the same language. And again, you're not trying to drive home the fact that the ribosome is yellow, because the ribosome isn't yellow. But again, you're trying to use a sort of consistent language. And that makes, I think that helps us support more students. So I think it increases the sort of efficacy of learning, the pedagogy, but then more students then feel included in the process. So I'd like to sort of end this part by looping back to what I started with. I always try to tell a story, right? And I noted windows and mirrors. For me, this is something I keep front and center. I find it very powerful. And yesterday I was listening to NPR in the morning, and there was a talk about a children's book that just came out. And it's this children's book called, right here, some of you may have heard it if you have young kids. It's called Once Upon a Book by Grace Lynn and Kate Messner. And the book has nothing to do with what we're talking about. But in talking about the book, these two co-authors talked about how this girl is going on all these adventures. She's learning lots of new things. And to me, that was the windows. But it was important for her to have a safe space, a place, a mirror, a place of home. They use the word home, an identity, where she could feel comfortable going out and exploring. And I kind of love that duality. And they said it better than me. So I thought, if it's okay, I'll play like 30 seconds of the interview. Again, the point I want to drive home, I'll go back for a second, is I think, again, what makes the book powerful and what makes it powerful for learning is this duality of exploration, make students feel a little uncomfortable, expose them to things they're unfamiliar with, but they have to do it from a place of safety where they feel heard, listened to, and identified. And listen to what, I think it's Kate talking.
You know, it's interesting. Grace and I have been talking a lot while we were on book tour this week about the driving forces behind our writing. And for me, that driving force has always been curiosity. I write a lot of books about nature and history, and I do a lot of nonfiction. And for Grace, she mentioned that writing, her goal is to help kids find a sense of security and home. And we realized that almost unintentionally, we had created a book that captures both of those mission statements, if you will, because stories do take us away, they transport us. I love how this story captures that sense of exploration and also comes right around to appreciating home.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Hearing that yesterday, I was thinking of windows and mirrors, and I think that's really what she was saying. She was putting windows and mirrors in a different way. And I don't know, that's something that I hold front and center, whether I'm writing a book, writing for a popular science audience, or just or standing in front of my classroom. I thought it'd be useful to actually share some resources. This is not going to be sort of a bibliography, but I thought I'd highlight 4 resources that I've come across that I find particularly useful recently. This was in the Chronicle of Higher Education, is now maybe a year or so old. We're on to reach all of your students. Here's how to make your teaching more inclusive. It's very accessible and engaging, and includes some case studies, which I thought was interesting. This is a paper from CBE Life Sciences, by Brian Dewsbury on inclusive teaching, which also includes practices. He particularly talks about active learning and structured classroom in this paper. I mentioned Emily Style and Windows and Mirrors many times, so I thought this is the National Seed Project. This is their curriculum as window and mirror. Again, this is an old curriculum. It goes back to, I think, the late 80s, and it's surprisingly relevant today. I think it's actually had a bit of a renaissance. And last one is, this just came out of Berkeley, Advancing Inclusion and Anti-Racism in the College Classroom. What's great, first of all, this is very recent, just out about a month ago, the resources in this and the attention to sort of practicality. What can you do in your classroom? What can you do in your syllabus to make a more inclusive environment? There's just some great things. And you may not agree with all of them, but I get as a place to start and to begin the conversation. So that's what I have to share with you. I hope some of that was useful. I'm happy to answer more questions. And also, if anybody wants to share through the Q&A things that they're doing in the classroom, as I said, I'm not an expert, and I learned so much from others who are, and a lot of these practices come from colleagues at Brandeis and elsewhere. So thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you, Jim.
Sure.
Please, if you have any questions, enter them in the Q&A now. One thing I just wanted to point out that came up earlier there, somebody was actually answering a question rather than asking it. Course Source, Jim, is that the site you were talking about, referring to the places to find in-class activities?
Course Source is a great one. I wasn't thinking of that. I was thinking, what is it? Is it SUNY? It's a New York based. They have a lot of case.
Oh, is it the Buffalo, the case studies?
That one, that's one. HHMI is another one, actually. It just came to mind. They have some great case activities around all kinds of things. And they also have some great videos, by the way, which I know that's not active learning, but it is a very a way to engage students.
Yeah, I had actually looked up that case studies link while you were chatting. I thought maybe that was what you were thinking of, so I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, sure. There are a lot of good resources out there. I mean, this is obviously a topic that a lot of people are paying attention to for really good reason.
Any other questions or comments, thoughts? Anything you'd like to share with the group? Give it a minute just in case somebody is.
And actually, I will throw out one more thing. As I said, the sort of project-based intro bio for the fall is something I'm actively thinking about. I've been talking to people in the accessibility office, but also other intro bio teachers. If people have thoughts about how to structure the syllabus, what kinds of projects would be meaningful, how to make it so it's Googleable as a start, but not as a stop, I would love input. And you can find me. I'm at Brandeis. You can easily find my email address. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts.
Just got one comment, Jim. It was, I like the idea of threshold grading for your project-based assessments. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm hoping that that'll make it both. My hope is that it'll do two things. One, from my point of view, make it easier to grade, but also not get into, I don't need them to get everything right for them to cross some threshold in which I feel like, okay, they got the learning objective. And if my learning objective is for them to say, understand the timeline, and if I give them a test and they get a 50%, well, then they didn't meet it. And yet they're going to do fine in the, I don't know, there's a disconnect there. So I'm hoping that will work. There's a lot of people at Brandeis who are using specs grading, which is a traditional exam, but they can take it as many times as they want. Say every Friday is a time to take an exam, and you can just take it until you pass. It's sort of mastery-based grading. I have another colleague who uses ungrading, which is a little bit more similar to what I'm talking about with project-based, but these are all ways of getting at student learning, supporting students, and moving the conversation towards the content and the skills and away from the points and the regrades. But we'll see how it goes.
All right. Well, I would just like to thank everybody who joined us today, and thank everybody who ends up watching this in the future. And most of all, thank you, Jim, for this presentation and all the thoughtful ideas and concepts you shared with us today.
Okay, my pleasure. Great to see everybody. Take care.
Thanks all.